23 years ago in a stone chamber, lit only by moonlight and the pale glow of prophecy crystals, Elder Priestess Moira spoke words that would shape the fate of an unborn child. King Aldrich Thornwolf stood before her, his silver wolf restless beneath his skin, his hands clasped behind his back, in the rigid posture of a man who had ruled the Silverpine territory for 20 years and intended to rule for 20 more. The High Council chamber was empty, except for the two of them, and the shadows that moved along the walls like living things responding to the power contained in the ancient stones. Moira's eyes had gone white. Completely white, the pupils vanished into milk, and when she spoke, her voice was not her own, but something older, something that had spoken through priestesses for 1,000 years before her and would speak through them 1,000 years after. When shadow finds the voiceless one, she said, and her breath misted in air that had gone suddenly impossibly cold, the silent throne shall wake. The wolfless child of stolen blood will break the old king's chains. Aldrich's jaw tightened. He was a king who had built his power on certainty, on the absolute knowledge that he controlled every variable in his territory, every wolf in his pack, every breath of wind that moved through the northern Rockies wilderness that surrounded Silverpine like a fortress of stone and snow. "What does it mean?" he said. His voice was level, but there was something beneath it, something that might have been fear in a smaller man. Moira blinked. Her eyes returned to their normal brown, and she swayed slightly, catching herself on the altar stone. She was 70 years old, and she had been delivering prophecies since before Aldrich was born, and she knew better than to elaborate on what the gods had chosen to reveal. "It means," she said carefully, "that there will be a child, wolfless, of your bloodline, and that child will change everything." Aldrich turned away from her. He walked to the chamber window, looking out over the territory that stretched for 100 miles in every direction, the forests and mountains and hidden valleys where his pack lived and hunted and raised their children according to laws that were older than the stones beneath his feet. "Find the child," he said. "When it comes, find it and eliminate the threat." Moira said nothing. She had learned long ago that kings do not want to be told they are making mistakes. They only want to be obeyed. She bowed and left the chamber, and Aldrich stood alone in the moonlight, and far away in the winter forest, a young prince named Dorian Thornwolf held the hand of a pack healer named Senna Ashwood and told her he loved her, and neither of them knew that they had 9 months left to live. The baby was born in spring. Senna delivered her alone in a cottage at the edge of the territory with only the sound of rain on the roof and her own labored breathing to mark the moment when a new life entered the world. She held her daughter and looked at the small, perfect face, the dark hair already thick on her head, and she felt the mate bond with Dorian sing through her chest like a chord of music that would never fade. She named her Rowan Ashwood, after the tree that grew in hard places and survived when everything else died. For 3 years they were happy. Dorian came to them in secret, bringing food and clothes and books, sitting with Senna in the lamplight, while Rowan slept in her cradle making plans for the day when Aldrich would die and Dorian would take the throne, and they could all three live together without hiding. That day never came. Counselor Marcus Graythorn came instead on a night when the moon was dark and the forest was silent. He came with 4 guards and a bag of silver coins and orders from his king that were very simple and very clear. Dorian died protecting the cottage door. 4 against 1, and he was a prince, not a warrior. And when Senna heard the sound stop, and the silence that followed was worse than any scream she knew. She took Rowan and ran. She ran through the forest for 3 days, carrying her daughter on her back, sleeping in hollow trees, drinking from streams, moving north and east away from Silverpine into the wild places where no pack claimed territory and anything could kill you. On the 4th day, she found Morgan. The Dark Witch lived in a cave system that wound through the mountains like the inside of a great stone heart, and she was old in the way that trees are old, her face lined with time and power and choices that had cost her things Senna could not imagine. "I need to hide my daughter," Senna said. She stood in the mouth of the cave with Rowan in her arms, and she was shaking, not with cold, but with exhaustion and grief and a desperation so complete it felt like drowning. Morgan looked at the child. She looked at Senna. She said, "The king seeks her because of prophecy. To hide her from prophecy, we must hide what she is. We must bind her wolf." "Do it," Senna said immediately. "It will cost you," Morgan said. "Magic of this depth requires payment. 20 years of your life force. You will age faster. You will die sooner. And the child will grow up believing she is incomplete, believing the emptiness inside her is her own failing rather than a theft." Senna looked at Rowan's sleeping face. 3 years old, perfect and innocent, and completely unaware that men were hunting her through the darkness. "Do it," she said again. The ritual took 3 hours. Senna held Rowan while Morrigan worked chanting in languages older than wolves, drawing symbols in the air, with hands that glowed with purple fire. And when it was finished, Senna felt something inside her daughter go dark, like a candle being snuffed, and Rowan whimpered in her sleep but did not wake. "It is done," Morgan said. "Her wolf is bound, sleeping. It will not wake unless the binding breaks, and the binding will not break unless she learns the truth of what was stolen from her. Keep the truth buried. Keep the child safe." Senna returned to Silverpine 6 months later. She told the pack she had been traveling, healing, grieving the loss of her mate. No one questioned her. Omega healers were valuable and rare, and Aldrich's anger at Dorian's death had burned itself out in the months since leaving, only a cold satisfaction that the problem had been solved. He never knew Dorian had a daughter. Greythorn knew, but Greythorn believed the child was dead, lost in the forest, or killed by rogues, and he filed the matter away as completed and moved on to other concerns. And Rowan grew up in the shadow of the palace in the stables where she worked from the age of 15, and she never knew she was a princess. She only knew she was broken. Spring 2024, 23 years and 2 months after the prophecy, 20 years and 3 months after the binding. Rowan Ashwood woke at dawn the way she always did, not because she wanted to, but because her body had learned years ago that sleeping past sunrise meant missing breakfast, and missing breakfast meant working hungry until midday, and working hungry meant mistakes, and mistakes in the royal stables meant punishment. She sat up in the narrow bed in the corner of the Omega dormitory, in the space she had occupied for 8 years, since the day her mother had brought her to the stable master, and said, "She can work. She's strong enough." The dormitory held 23 Omegas, all of them assigned to various service roles throughout the palace grounds. Rowan was the only one who worked exclusively with the horses, the only one who had that particular combination of patience and competence and complete lack of social standing that made her useful for the job no one else wanted. She dressed in work pants that had been patched 3 times, a shirt faded to the color of old denim boots that pinched her left foot. She braided her dark hair in a single plait down her back, washed her face in the communal basin, and walked out into the morning without speaking to anyone. No one spoke to her either. This was normal. The stable complex was the largest building on the palace grounds, apart from the Great Hall itself. 3 stories of stone and timber, with windows set high enough that the horses could not reach them, but low enough that light came through in golden shafts during the afternoon. Rowan had been working here for 8 years, and she knew every inch of it. Every stall, every tack room, every hidden corner where she could sit during her brief rest periods and sketch maps in a notebook, she kept hidden under a loose floorboard in the feed room. The maps were her secret. For 5 years since she turned 18 and started thinking seriously about a future that did not involve dying in these stables, she had been mapping the Silverpine territory. Every trail she walked on her days off, every stream she crossed, every cave system and ridgeline and hidden valley within 50 miles of the palace. She was preparing to run. On her 25th birthday, she would take her maps and her small savings and disappear into the wilderness, away from Silverpine, away from the pack that had never wanted her. 2 more years. 730 days, she had counted. But that morning, walking into the stables with the spring sun just beginning to warm the air and the nightmares stirring in their stalls, Rowan did not know that she would never reach her 25th birthday as a stable hand. She only knew that the head nightmare, a massive black mare named Tempest, who stood 17 hands high and had killed 2 handlers before Rowan learned to manage her, was stamping in her stall with the particular rhythm that meant a storm was coming. Rowan paused in the corridor, listening. The other 11 nightmares were restless, too shifting and snorting their hooves loud on the stone floors. Nightmares were not regular horses. They were creatures of magic bred by pack witches centuries ago to serve as mounts for elite guards, and they were faster and stronger and meaner than anything natural had a right to be. Their eyes glowed faint red in darkness. They were also, Rowan had discovered, extraordinarily sensitive to atmospheric pressure changes. She walked to Tempest's stall and looked at the mare, who looked back at her with eyes more intelligent than most wolves gave her credit for. "Blizzard," Rowan said quietly, "or just rain." Tempest stamped twice, then 3 times. 2 for storm, 3 for snow. Rowan glanced at the sky, visible through the high windows. Clear blue, not a cloud in sight. But Tempest had never been wrong before. She made a mental note to tell the stable master. He would ignore her. Then tomorrow, when the snow started falling, he would act like it was his own idea, and she would let him, because arguing meant punishment. This was the shape of her life. Small observations, smaller responses, and the constant background hum of being nothing. She began the morning routine. Hay for all 12 nightmares. Fresh water in each stall bucket. Hooves picked clean. Tack inspection. She worked steadily for 3 hours until the sun was fully up and her hands smelled like horse and leather and hay. She was in the tack room repairing a bridle strap that had started to fray when she heard the sound. It came from outside, distant but clear, a low, rhythmic vibration that she felt more in her chest than in her ears. A sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a purr, but something in between. Rowan went very still. In the main stable, the nightmares erupted. All 12 of them, simultaneously, a crashing wave of panic that moved from north to south down the line of stalls as though something enormous and unseen was walking toward her. She stood up. The bridle fell from her hands. She walked to the tack room door and looked out into the corridor. The Shadow Panther was already there. It stood at the open end of the stable corridor, and it was bigger than anything she had ever seen that was not a building. Rowan knew in the abstract, factual way that pack members knew things about their king, that Alpha Kale Thornwolf possessed a Shadow Panther as his inner beast rather than a wolf. She knew this the way she knew that the binding moon ceremony happened once a year in the spring and that the Council of Six met every Thursday. It was information that existed in her mind as fact, but had never touched her as reality. Until now. Until this precise moment when it stood 30 feet away from her, with its massive shoulders rolling beneath a coat so black it seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it, and its eyes pale silver and absolutely still were fixed entirely on her. The nightmares were screaming now. The sound was physical battering against her ears, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she registered that this would bring handlers running, that this would alert the entire eastern grounds. But most of her attention was on the panther. It was not moving. Not yet. It stood in that pool of morning sunlight like something carved from midnight, every line of its body expressing a coiled readiness that could explode into violence in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Rowan did not run. She would not have been able to explain afterward why she did not run, except to say that something in her knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely, that running would be the last thing she ever did. She stood very still. She held the doorframe with one hand like it was an anchor. She breathed. The panther's head was low, its gaze unbroken, and it began to move toward her with slow, deliberate steps that made no sound at all on the stable floor. 20 feet, 15, 10. She could feel the heat of it now radiating from its body like a furnace. She could smell it, a deep, complex scent that was nothing like animal and nothing like human, but something older than both. 5 feet, 3. The panther stopped. This close, she could see the individual muscles moving beneath its coat, could see the faint pattern of darker black rosettes that marked its shoulders and flanks. She could see its eyes silver like winter ice, and in them an intelligence that was not animal and not entirely human either. It lowered its great head, slowly with a deliberation that felt like ceremony. It opened its mouth and she saw the teeth long and white and absolutely capable of ending her. And then it exhaled a long, slow breath that was warm against her stomach through the thin fabric of her shirt. And then it pressed its massive head against her abdomen and went completely still. Rowan stood frozen. She was not sure she was breathing. The panther's weight against her was extraordinarily warm and solid and devastatingly gentle, and she did not know what to do with her hands. So she kept them at her sides and she waited for something to make sense. Nothing did. The nightmares had gone quiet. The stable had gone quiet. The entire morning it felt like it was holding its breath. And then, without fully deciding to do it, Rowan lifted her left hand and placed it very slowly on the panther's head. Its fur was softer than she would have imagined. She felt the sound it made more than heard it, a deep resonance that moved through her palm and up her arm and settled somewhere near her heart. "What are you doing?" she whispered. The panther did not answer. It pressed closer. That was how they found her. 6 of the king's elite guards came sprinting toward the stables with weapons drawn and faces pale. They came through the stable door ready for carnage and found a girl with dark hair escaping from a single braid and work clothes that had seen better years, standing in morning sunlight, with the king's shadow panther pressed against her like an oversized house cat, her left hand resting on its head, her expression somewhere between terrified and bewildered. One of the guards made a sound that was almost a word. None of them moved. The panther lifted its head and looked at them, and every one of those trained warriors took an involuntary step backward. "Do not move," the guard captain said. Rowan stayed very still. She heard him before she saw him. A voice she had never been addressed by directly but had heard from across large rooms on ceremonial days. "Move," Alpha King Kale Thornwolf said, and the guards scattered like leaves. He was still dressed from the early morning council session. Dark formal clothes, the silver chain of office at his collar catching the light as he moved. His steel gray eyes swept over to the scene. He stopped when he saw her. He stopped more completely than she expected, like a machine that had been switched off mid-motion. He looked at his panther still leaning against a stable hand. He looked at Rowan. A flicker crossed his features that was there and gone before she could name it. "Back away from her," he said quietly, and Rowan realized he was talking to the panther. The panther did not move. Kale said it again, still quiet, still steady. The panther turned its great head and looked at him, and then turned back to Rowan and pressed more firmly against her. Several of the guards made small sounds, worried sounds. Kale Thornwolf went very still in a way that meant something significant was happening beneath a surface that showed very little. "What is your name?" he said. "Rowan," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. "Rowan Ashwood. I work in the stables, Your Majesty. I was repairing tack. I did not invite it in." The corner of his mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile. "I did not think you had," he said. His gaze moved over her, assessing, not with shock and confusion, but with focused attention, cataloging information, trying to solve a puzzle. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. "8 years, Your Majesty. And in those 8 years, have you ever approached the East Wing, the containment chamber?" "No, Your Majesty. Omegas are not permitted in that section." "Have you ever seen the panther before today?" "No, Your Majesty. Only heard of it." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, the slight movement at his brow, the only external evidence of whatever was happening behind those eyes. "The panther has never done this," he said finally, and his voice had changed slightly, had dropped some of the formal distance. "Not once, not with anyone, not with me." Rowan absorbed this. She looked down at the panther's head still pressed against her stomach. "I see," she said, because she did not know what else to say. "It recognized something in you," Kale said. He took a step closer, slow and careful. "I do not know what, but it recognized something." And he paused at the edge of the sunlight. "I would like to find out what that is," he said. "You will be moved to the East Wing. You will remain available for observation and testing until we understand this phenomenon. Is that acceptable?" It was not phrased as a question. Not really. She understood this. She also understood that a girl who worked in the stables, who had no wolf and no rank and no family connections, did not say no to the Alpha King. But she found herself looking at him directly and finding that his eyes up close had a depth to them that she had not expected, more human than his reputation had led her to believe. "It is acceptable," she said, "but I would like to understand it too." This time it was definitely closer to a smile. "Then we have a common interest," he said. He looked at the panther, and his face softened in a way that suggested whatever else this creature was, it was also something he cared for deeply. "Come," he said to it, using the voice of command. The panther lifted its head from Rowan's stomach. It looked at her for a long moment with those pale silver eyes, and then it turned and walked to Kyle, moving with liquid grace, and sat down at his feet. Kyle looked at Rowan across the distance. "What do you think will happen next?" he said, and for a moment she thought he was asking her to predict the future. But then she realized he was asking what she wanted to happen. He was giving her a choice. No one had given her a choice in 8 years. "I think," she said slowly, "that my life is about to become very different from what it was an hour ago." "Yes," Kale Thornwolf said. "I think you are correct." He turned and walked toward the stable entrance, and the panther followed him, and the guards followed both of them, and Rowan stood in the corridor with the smell of horses and the morning sun on her face, and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Something had just happened. Something enormous. She did not know what it was yet, but she could feel it the way Tempest could feel a storm coming 3 days before the first clouds appeared. The shape of her life was changing, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something that was not quite hope, but was close enough that it made her hands shake. She looked down at her left hand, the one that had touched the panther's head, and saw that her palm was marked with a faint silvery shimmer, like frost that refused to melt. She touched it with her right hand and felt nothing unusual. Just skin. But when she looked at it in the slanting morning light, the shimmer was still there, faint but undeniable. A mark. A sign. Something that had not been there before. Rowan Ashwood put her hand in her pocket and walked out of the stable into the day that would be the last day of the life she had known. For now she only knew that the Shadow Panther had found her, and nothing would ever be the same. The East Wing was a different world. The corridors had carpets woven in patterns that spoke of pack history, deep reds and golds that muffled footsteps. The walls held tapestries depicting moments she recognized from ceremonial stories: the first hunt, the treaty of the northern packs, the moonstone binding. The air smelled of beeswax candles and something floral that changed with the seasons. The woman who showed her to her room was named Iris, a beta in her 40s, with kind eyes and efficient movements that suggested she had managed the East Wing household long enough to have seen stranger things than a stable hand being moved into royal quarters. "This is yours," Iris said, opening a door halfway down a corridor. "Private. The king's orders were clear. You're not to be disturbed except for meals and when you're needed at the containment chamber." Rowan stepped into the room and stopped. It had a window, a real window that took up half of one wall and looked out over the east gardens where cherry trees were just beginning to bloom. It had a bed with a wooden frame and a mattress with actual padding and 3 blankets. It had a desk positioned beneath the window where morning light would fall directly on it. It had space enough that she could stand in the center and extend her arms fully without touching anything. "Meals are delivered," Iris was saying. "Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Bathhouse is down the hall, 3rd door on the left. Laundry is Wednesdays and Saturdays." She paused, her expression caught between pity and curiosity. "The king will send for you when he's ready," she said. "Until then, you're free to settle in. This is your space now. No one will enter without permission." Rowan turned slowly, taking in the window and the bed and the desk and the small bookshelf that was currently empty but implied a future where she might have things to put on it. "How long?" she asked. "How long what? How long will I be here in this room in the East Wing?" Iris tilted her head slightly. "I don't think anyone knows yet, dear. This situation is unprecedented. The Shadow Panther has never chosen anyone before. The king will want to understand why it chose you." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I've worked in this wing for 23 years. I've seen a lot of people come through these halls, and I've never seen the king look at anyone the way he looked at you this morning." "What way?" Rowan asked. "Like you were a puzzle he very much wanted to solve," Iris said, "and Kale Thornwolf doesn't like unsolved puzzles." She left and Rowan stood in the center of the room for a long time, just breathing, just existing in a space that was hers and no one else's. That night, alone in a bed that was too soft and too quiet, she lay staring at the ceiling for 2 hours before sleep finally found her. And when she dreamed of running through a forest she had never seen with senses she did not possess, seeing in the darkness, with impossible clarity, smelling things that had no names in human vocabulary, feeling the ground beneath paws instead of feet. She woke with her heart racing in the faint silver shimmer on her palm, glowing in the pre-dawn darkness like a lost star. The containment chamber was in the deepest part of the East Wing, down 3 flights of spiral stairs into stone that predated the current palace structure by centuries. A guard named Thomas escorted her on her second morning, maintaining professional silence that she appreciated. The chamber door was reinforced iron, 6 inches thick, with a locking mechanism requiring 3 separate keys and a blood seal in the center. Thomas pressed his palm to it. The seal glowed red, then green. The locks disengaged with heavy clicks. "I'll wait here," he said. "You're expected." Rowan stepped through and the door closed behind her with finality. The chamber was larger than she'd imagined. High stone ceilings disappeared into shadows even with spelled lamps burning. Natural light fell through narrow slits, set too high to reach, creating geometric patterns on smooth stone floors worn by generations of feet and paws. There were marks scored into it, deep gouges made by claws the size of daggers. In the center, lying on a wide stone ledge, was the Shadow Panther. It raised its head when she entered. Those pale silver eyes fixed on her immediately with focus that suggested it had been waiting, that it had known she was coming before the door opened. Kale Thornwolf stood near the far wall. He was dressed more casually than in the stable dark pants and a simple shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. There was something about seeing him without formal trappings that made him seem both more human and somehow more dangerous. "Come in," he said. "It won't hurt you." "How do you know?" Rowan asked, staying near the door. "Because it would have hurt you in the stable if that was its intention," Kale said reasonably. "The panther doesn't hesitate. If it wanted you dead, you would be dead." This was not as reassuring as he seemed to think, but Rowan found herself walking forward anyway, moving slowly across the stone floor toward the ledge. It watched her approach with intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. There was recognition in its gaze, something that went beyond mere animal awareness. She stopped 3 feet from the ledge, close enough to reach out and touch, far enough that she could theoretically run if the panther changed its mind about her continued existence. "Sit," Kale said. "There's a bench on the other side. This may take a while." Rowan circled around and found the bench, a simple stone seat carved directly from the chamber floor. She sat. The panther immediately rose and moved toward her with that liquid grace that made no sound. and before she could react, it had lowered its massive head onto her knee with the same gentle deliberation it had shown in the stable. The weight was extraordinary, warm and solid and devastating in its trust. Rowan's hands hovered uncertain, and then she did what she had done before, placed one hand on the panther's head, and felt that deep resonant purr move through her palm and settle somewhere near her heart. Kale was watching with fascination mixed with unexpected envy. "It never does this with me," he said after a moment. "It responds to me, obeys me mostly, but it has never sought comfort from me. Not like this." "I don't understand why," Rowan said honestly. "I'm nobody, just a stable hand. I have nothing to offer it." "Clearly you have something," Kale said. He moved closer, settling onto the bench on the opposite side so the panther was between them. "The question is what?" He was quiet, studying her face. "Tell me about your mother," he said. Rowan's hands stilled. "What would you like to know?" "Anything. Everything." She weighed what was safe to share against what might be dangerous, then realized she was tired of calculating. Safety, tired of measuring every word. "She was a pack healer," Rowan said. "Low-ranking. She never found her mate, or if she did, she never spoke of him. She had me when she was very young. I don't know who my father was. She never said, and I learned not to ask. And she's still here in Silverpine." "Yes, she works in the healer's cottage on the western edge. We don't speak much." Kale's eyes sharpened. "Why not?" Rowan looked down at the panther, at her hand resting on its head, at the faint silver shimmer on her palm that seemed brighter now. "I think," she said slowly, "that it's hard for her to look at me. I remind her of something she'd rather forget." "What?" "I don't know. She's never told me." This was true and not true at the same time. Rowan had always sensed that her mother carried some deep wound that had never healed, some grief that went beyond normal sorrow. But Senna Ashwood kept her own counsel, maintained professional distance, even from her daughter. Kale was quiet, then said something that surprised her. "I know what it's like to have a parent who looks through you instead of at you." Rowan glanced up at him. His face was carefully neutral, but there was something beneath it that understood the specific loneliness of being invisible to those who were supposed to see you most clearly. "Your father," she asked, testing boundaries. "He was a hard man," Kale said. "Harder than history records. He ruled through fear more than loyalty. When I was young, I thought that was what strength looked like. It took me years to understand that cruelty and strength are not the same thing." He looked at the panther, and his face softened in that way that transformed it from regal to human. "The panther was his before it was mine," he said. "It passed to me when he died, as it has passed from father to son for 7 generations. Every one of those men learned to control it, to use it to channel its power. But none of them ever had this." He gestured at the scene, the panther lying peacefully with its head on Rowan's knee, contentment radiating from its massive frame. "None of them were ever its comfort," Kale said quietly. "They were its masters. This is different. This is something I don't understand." Rowan felt the panther's breathing beneath her hand, slow and even and impossibly peaceful, and she said something from instinct rather than thought. "Maybe it's tired of being mastered," she said. "Maybe it just wanted someone who would touch it without wanting something from it." Kale looked at her then with an expression entirely unguarded, entirely present, and she saw in his face the weight of kingship and the loneliness of power, and something else that might have been hope. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it recognized something in you that neither of us can see yet." They sat like that for a long time, the three of them in the lamplit chamber, and Rowan found herself talking in a way she hadn't talked in years. She told him about the stables, about learning to manage nightmares through patience rather than force. She told him about Tempest, the murderous mare, who now ate sugar cubes from Rowan's palm. She told him about her maps pulling the secret from where she had kept it hidden for 5 years. "I've been mapping the territory," she said. "Every trail, every water source, every cave system within 50 miles. I was going to leave when I turned 25. Disappear into the wilderness and try to survive on my own." Kale listened without judgment, without the anger she might have expected. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because I don't have a wolf," Rowan said. The words came out flat and factual. "Because without a wolf, I'll never be more than what I am now. And what I am now is nothing. Invisible. A body that performs labor and is otherwise irrelevant to the pack." She paused, looking at the panther. "I thought if I could make it to neutral territory, maybe I could find a place where being wolfless didn't matter so much," she said. "Maybe I could just be a person instead of a deficit." Kale was very still, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter and more intense. You are not nothing, he said, and you are certainly not invisible, not anymore. Rowan looked at him across the space that separated them, across the warm body of the panther that rested between them like a bridge, and she saw in his steel-gray eyes something that made her chest tighten. What happens now? She asked. Now, Kale said, we figure out why the panther chose you. We run tests. We bring in the pack historian. And we find out what you are, Rowan Ashwood, because I don't think you're what you believe yourself to be. He stood moving with controlled grace. I need to understand this, he said. Not because it's politically useful, though it might be. Not because it's strategically valuable, though it could be. But because that panther has been part of my Blekodoini for 7 generations, and in all that time it has responded to 2 people, myself and my father. And now you, and I need to know why. He paused at the chamber door. Tomorrow the historian will join us. His name is Aldwin, and he's forgotten more about pack lineage and ancient magic than most wolves ever learn. If there's an answer in the records, he'll find it. And if there isn't an answer in the records, Rowan asked. Kale smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him, warm and slightly dangerous. Then we'll make new records, he said, and you'll be the first line written. He left, and the door closed with those heavy clicks, and Rowan sat alone with the shadow panther in lamplight and morning sun. The panther lifted its head from her knee and looked at her with those silver eyes, and then it did something that made her breath catch. It opened its mouth and very gently closed its teeth around her wrist. Not biting, not threatening, just holding. The way a mother wolf would carry a cub. Rowan froze. The panther's teeth were warm against her skin, the pressure steady but not painful. And then she felt something else, a pull deep in her chest like a thread being drawn tight, a connection forming silver and bright and utterly impossible. In her mind, suddenly and without warning, she saw the chamber from a different angle, from lower down, from the panther's perspective. She saw herself sitting on the stone bench with wide eyes and her hands still raised, and she saw the faint shimmer of silver that surrounded her like an aura visible only to whatever senses the panther possessed that went beyond ordinary sight. And then the vision snapped shut like a door closing, and she was back in her own head, gasping, and the panther released her wrist and made that deep purring sound. Rowan looked at her wrist. There were no marks, no indentations, nothing to suggest anything unusual had just happened. But she knew. In the wordless way that bodies know things before minds catch up, she knew that something fundamental had just changed. The panther had not just chosen her. It had begun to share itself with her. And when she left the chamber an hour later, climbing the spiral stairs with Thomas escorting her, in professional silence, Rowan carried with her the memory of seeing through eyes that were not her own, and the knowledge that whatever she had been before this morning, she was becoming something different now. Something that did not yet have a name, but had already begun to take shape in the silver shimmer on her palm and the thread of connection that tied her to a creature that had existed for 7 generations without ever choosing anyone. Until her. Aldwin arrived the next morning with 3 leather-bound volumes under one arm and barely contained excitement that made him look younger than his 70 years. He was a small man, compact and precise, with white hair pulled back in a tail that reached halfway down his spine. He wore the dark robes of a pack historian, embroidered at the collar with silver thread, and he moved through the containment chamber with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in the company of old stones and older secrets. Extraordinary, he said before he'd even fully entered. He was looking at Rowan with intensity that made her want to step backward. Absolutely extraordinary. When the king told me what happened, I thought perhaps he was exaggerating. Kale tends toward understatement, so if he said, the panther chose you, I assumed it merely tolerated your presence. But this? He gestured at the scene, Rowan sitting on the stone bench with the shadow panther's head resting on her knee, her hand absently stroking the soft fur behind its ears, the creature's eyes half closed in contentment. This is something I have not seen in my lifetime, Aldwin said. And I have seen a great many things. Kale stood near the chamber wall, arms crossed, watching with that focused attention Rowan was beginning to recognize as his default state when confronted with puzzles. You've read the old texts, Kale said. Anything about the panther choosing someone outside the royal line? Aldwin set his volumes down on a small table and began leafing through the oldest one, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency across pages that looked fragile enough to crumble. The shadow panther has been part of the thorn wolf bloodline for 7 generations, he said in measured cadence. It passes from king to son, father to heir, and in all that time it has bonded with exactly 14 men, never a woman, never anyone outside the direct royal succession. He paused, looking up to study Rowan's face. Until now, apparently. What about the legends, Kale asked? The older stories. Before my line claimed it. Aldwin's expression shifted into something more complex, part scholarly interest and part caution. The very old texts speak of the Shadow Panther as something that existed before the Thornwolf line claimed dominion over Silverpine, he said carefully. They speak of it as a guardian spirit, something that chose its own companions based on criteria that had nothing to do with bloodline or political power. He flipped through several more pages, found what he was looking for, and read aloud in a voice that had dropped into something more formal, more ceremonial. When Shadow finds the voiceless one, the bond of old shall wake again. The one who bears no wolf's mark shall see through darkness, shall command the ancient power, shall walk between two worlds. The words seemed to hang in the chamber air, heavy with implication. Rowan's hand stilled on the panther's head. Voiceless one, she said quietly. Someone without a wolf. Precisely, Aldwin said, eyes bright with excitement that came from watching prophecy unfold in real time. The text is from the First Age, written in Old Tongue, and it's been dismissed for generations as mythology rather than prediction. But if we're being literal about the translation, it suggests that the panther was always meant to bond with someone wolfless. Kale pushed off from the wall, moving closer to the table where Aldwin had spread his volumes. What else does it say, he asked. About this bond, about what happens when it forms. Aldwin's finger traced down the page, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on reverence. It speaks of twin sight, he said. The ability to see through the panther's eyes, to share its perception, its enhanced senses, its understanding of what moves in darkness and shadow. In the old language, it's called dual sight. The panther and its chosen become extensions of each other's awareness. He looked at Rowan directly. Have you experienced anything like this? Visions that are not your own? Moments where you perceive the world from a different vantage point? Rowan thought of the dream she'd had 2 nights ago, running through forests with senses she didn't possess. She thought of yesterday in this very chamber, when the panther had closed its teeth gently around her wrist, and she had suddenly seen herself from its perspective, surrounded by that silver shimmer her human eyes could not detect. Yes, she said, twice. Once in a dream, once when the panther touched me. Aldwin and Kale exchanged a look that communicated something complex passing between them. The bond is already forming, Aldwin said, faster than it should be. The text suggests twin sight develops over months, sometimes years. But if you're already experiencing visions after only 2 days. He trailed off, returning to his volumes with renewed urgency, flipping through pages with increasing speed. There has to be a reason, he muttered half to himself. The panther doesn't form bonds randomly. It recognizes something. Bloodline magical signature, something that marks you as compatible with its nature. He stopped suddenly on a page near the back of the second volume, his finger pressed against text that looked faded almost to illegibility. Here, he said, a passage about blood recognition. It says the Shadow Panther can sense royal lineage even when it's been obscured. The word hung in the air like smoke. Kale moved to stand behind Aldwin, reading over his shoulder, and Rowan saw something shift in his expression, something that went from curious to very, very focused. Obscured how? Kale asked, his voice carefully neutral. Magic, Aldwin said simply. Blood magic specifically. The kind used to suppress or hide a wolf's manifestation. It's ancient practice, mostly forbidden now, but it was used occasionally in the old days to protect children of questionable lineage from being identified and eliminated. Rowan felt something cold settle in her stomach. The panther, sensing her distress, lifted its head from her knee and made a low, questioning sound. You think someone used blood magic on me? She asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I think, Aldwin said carefully, that we should test your blood. If there's royal lineage in your history, even distant, even obscured, the tests will reveal it. And that would explain why the panther recognized you when no one else did. Kale was already moving, striding toward the chamber door with purposeful energy that suggested decisions had been made and actions would follow immediately. We'll test her, he said, today, and we'll pull the genealogical records for the past 3 generations. If there's royal blood in Rowan's line, I want to know whose and how it got there. He paused at the door, looking back at Rowan. With your permission, he added, and there was something in his voice that suggested the permission was genuinely being requested, not assumed. Rowan thought about her mother's silence, about the way Senna had always deflected questions about Rowan's father, about the 23 years of careful distance maintained between them like a wall built 1 brick at a time. She thought about the emptiness where her wolf should have been, the hollow, aching absence that she had carried for so long she barely noticed it anymore, except in moments like pack runs when everyone shifted and she remained human and alone. And she thought about the panther's teeth closing gently around her wrist and the vision that had followed, seeing herself wreathed in silver light that marked her as something other than what she believed herself to be. Yes, she said, test me. I want to know. The blood test was performed in a small medical room off the East Wing's main corridor, with Senna Ashwood herself conducting it because she was the most skilled pack healer in Silverpine, and because Kael had summoned her with the kind of direct royal command that did not permit refusal. Rowan sat on the examination table and watched her mother prepare the instruments with the same professional efficiency she brought to all her work, and she tried to read something in Senna's face that might hint at what was coming. But Senna's expression was closed, carefully neutral, and her hands were steady as she tied the tourniquet around Rowan's upper arm and swabbed the inside of her elbow with something that smelled sharp and medicinal. This will hurt, Senna said, the first words she had spoken since entering the room. I know, Rowan said. The needle went in clean and quick, and Rowan watched her blood flow into the vial, dark red and ordinary looking, carrying whatever secrets her lineage held locked in its cells and chemistry. Senna filled 3 vials, labeled them with careful notation, and then withdrew the needle and pressed gauze against the puncture site with pressure that was exactly calibrated to be effective without being gentle. Hold that, she said, and Rowan held it. Kael stood near the door, watching this exchange with attention that missed nothing. Aldwin was beside him, clutching his volumes like they contained answers he was anxious to cross-reference. How long for results? Kael asked. 4 hours for basic lineage markers, Senna said without looking at him. 8 for detailed mapping. 12 if you want certainty about magical interference. We'll wait for certainty, Kael said. Senna's jaw tightened fractionally, the only sign that she had any emotional response to the situation at all. And then she gathered her vials and instruments and moved toward the door with the kind of controlled grace that Rowan suddenly recognized as a survival mechanism she herself had perfected over years of being invisible. Senna, Kael said, and his voice carried the weight of royal authority. If the tests show what I think they'll show, we'll need to talk, you and I, about things that should have been disclosed 23 years ago. Senna stopped. She did not turn around, but Rowan saw her shoulders stiffen, saw the way her hands tightened on the tray she carried. Yes, Your Majesty, she said quietly. And then she left, and the room felt larger and colder in her absence. Rowan removed the gauze from her arm, found the puncture site had already stopped bleeding, and looked at Kael with a directness she was still learning she was permitted. What do you think the tests will show? She asked. Kael crossed the room to stand in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and very certain. I think, he said, that you are not who you believe yourself to be. I think someone went to great lengths to make sure you never discovered what you are. And I think your mother knows exactly what was done to you and has been keeping that knowledge locked away for your entire life. He paused, and something in his expression softened. I also think, he said, that whatever the tests reveal, it won't change the fact that the Panther has chosen you. That bond is real. It exists independent of bloodline or magic or political convenience. And that means you have value here, Rowan. You have a place, whether your blood carries royal markers or not. Rowan felt something in her chest tighten and release simultaneously, like a knot that had been tied so long she'd forgotten it was there. Thank you, she said, and meant it. The 12 hours passed slowly. Rowan spent them in the containment chamber with the Panther sitting on the stone bench, while Aldwin worked at the small table he'd claimed as his own cross-referencing texts and making notes in handwriting so small and precise it looked like insect tracks across the page. Kael came and went, attending to the business of running a territory, but he returned every few hours to check on their progress, to ask questions, to sit with them in that companionable silence that Rowan was beginning to understand was his way of processing information. During one of these visits, the Panther did something it had not done before. It stood from where it had been resting with its head on Rowan's knee, walked to where Kael sat on the opposite bench, and very deliberately placed itself between them, its body spanning the distance like a bridge, its head resting against Kael's thigh, while its hindquarters pressed against Rowan's legs. Kael looked startled, then pleased, and he placed his hand on the Panther's head with reverence that suggested this was a gift he had not expected to receive. It's never done this either, he said quietly. Never positioned itself to touch both of us simultaneously. It's always been either or. Me or solitude. Never connection. Rowan placed her hand on the Panther's back, feeling the warmth of its body, the steady rise and fall of its breathing, and she felt that silver thread of connection pull tighter, felt the edges of her consciousness brush against something vast and ancient that lived inside the creature between them. And then without warning, the vision came again. She saw the chamber from the panther's perspective, but this time it was clearer, more stable, as if the connection had strengthened enough to support sustained viewing. She saw Kael from the panther's angle, and around him there was light. Not the silver shimmer that surrounded her, but something different, something gold and fierce, and absolutely steady like a sun that never wavered. She saw herself, and the silver around her was brighter, now pulsing slightly in rhythm with her heartbeat. And she saw the thread that connected them visible in the panther's sight as a cord of silver gold that ran from her chest to Kael's, passing through the panther itself, like it was the anchor point holding the connection stable. The vision lasted perhaps 10 seconds before it released her, and when her eyes refocused on the ordinary chamber, she found Kael staring at her with dawning realization. "You just had another vision," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Rowan said. Her voice came out breathless. "I saw us. From its perspective, there was light around you, gold, and around me, silver, and between us a thread." Aldwin's head snapped up from his text, his eyes wide. "The bond cord," he said. "You saw the mate bond forming." The words fell into silence. Rowan's heart was suddenly beating very hard, very fast, and she could not seem to get enough air into her lungs. "That's not possible," she said. "Mate bonds form between wolves who recognize each other. I don't have a wolf. I can't have a mate bond." "You have a wolf," Aldwin said with absolute certainty. "It's been bound, suppressed, hidden behind magical walls. But it's there, Rowan. It's always been there. And the panther recognized it even when you couldn't." He stood moving to stand in front of her with the intensity of a scholar who had just watched theory become proof. "The panther is connected to the Thornwolf bloodline through 7 generations of kings," he said. "It recognizes royal blood. It recognizes magical signature. And if it's forming a bond cord with you and the king simultaneously, that means it's recognized you as something compatible with that bloodline, as someone who belongs." Kael's hand had gone very still on the panther's head, and when Rowan looked at him, she saw in his face the same realization she was having, the same impossible understanding clicking into place. "The prophecy," Kael said quietly, "when shadow finds the voiceless one. The voiceless one isn't someone who lacks a wolf, it's someone whose wolf has been silenced, deliberately." "Yes," Aldwin said. "And if I'm right about what the blood tests are going to show, someone silenced your wolf because they were afraid of what you would become if it was allowed to wake." The chamber door opened before Rowan could respond, and Senna entered carrying a folder that looked too thin to contain world-changing information but somehow did anyway. Her face was pale, her hands steady, and when she looked at Rowan there was something in her expression that might have been grief, or might have been relief, or might have been both at once. "The tests are complete," she said. Kael stood, and Senna opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in technical notation that Rowan couldn't read, and her voice when she spoke was absolutely level and absolutely certain. "She carries the Thornwolf genetic markers," Senna said. "Direct line, first-generation royal descent. And there is evidence of magical interference in her blood chemistry dating back approximately 20 years. Someone used a blood-binding curse on her when she was very young, possibly as young as 3 years old." She looked at Rowan directly for the first time in 8 years, and her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if no one knew what you were, you would be safe. But all I did was steal 20 years of your life. All I did was make you believe you were broken when you were whole the entire time." Rowan stood slowly from the bench, the panther moving aside to let her rise, and she crossed the distance to her mother with steps that felt like walking through water. "What am I?" she asked. Her voice shook. "Who am I?" Senna's hands trembled as she reached out, hovering near Rowan's face but not quite touching, as if she had lost the right to that intimacy years ago. "You're the daughter of Prince Dorian Thornwolf," Senna said. "King Aldrich's younger brother. The man I loved. The man who was killed trying to protect us from Aldrich's wrath when the prophecy was revealed." She drew a shaking breath. "You're a princess, Rowan. You've always been a princess. And I bound your wolf to hide you from the king who wanted you dead." The chamber was absolutely silent except for the sound of Rowan's breathing and the low rumble of the panther's purr and the distant echo of water dripping somewhere in the stone foundations beneath them. Kael moved to stand beside Rowan close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the weight of royal authority and absolutely none of its distance. "Who ordered the binding?" he asked Senna. "Who performed the curse?" Senna's eyes moved to him, and in them was a weariness that went bone deep. "Counselor Marcus Greythorn killed Dorian on King Aldrich's command," she said. But the binding curse that was my decision alone. I fled with Rowan and found the dark witch Morrigan in the wilderness. Aldrich never knew I bound your wolf. He died believing you perished with your father. And it worked, Aldwin said quietly. Aldrich died 3 years ago, never knowing his brother had a daughter. Never knowing the prophecy he tried to prevent had survived his attempts to eliminate it. He looked at Rowan with something like awe. You survived, he said, against all odds, against royal decree, against magical suppression that should have killed your wolf entirely. You survived. And now the panther has found you. The voiceless one. The child of stolen blood, exactly as the prophecy said you would be found. Rowan felt her knees weaken, felt the enormity of what she was hearing crash over her like a wave, and Kyl's hand was suddenly on her elbow, steadying her, keeping her upright. Sit, he said gently, guiding her back to the bench. This is a lot to process. 23 years, Rowan said. The words came out hollow. 23 years of believing I was nothing, of being invisible, of planning to run away into the wilderness because I thought I would never belong anywhere. She looked at her mother, at the woman who had raised her in careful distance, and never once explained why. You let me believe I was broken, she said. You let me grow up thinking the emptiness was my fault, my failure. I know, Senna said, and tears were streaming down her face now unchecked. I know, and I'm sorry. I thought it was better than the alternative. Better than you knowing you were royal and hunted. Better than you carrying the weight of your father's death and Aldrich's Harwin. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself, Rowan said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a terrible clarity. You were protecting yourself from the guilt of surviving when he didn't. Senna made a sound like something breaking, and she turned away, shoulders shaking, and Rowan watched her mother cry and felt nothing but a vast emptiness where 23 years of emotion should have been. Kale's hand remained on her elbow, warm and steady, and when she looked at him, she saw in his face something that was not pity and not sympathy, but understanding, the kind that came from carrying his own burdens of inheritance and expectation and the weight of choices made by people who were dead before you were born. What happens now? Rowan asked. And Cale Thornwell, Alpha King of Silverpine, who had just discovered that the stable hand his panther had chosen was actually his cousin, looked at her with steel gray eyes that held conviction and something else she could not quite name. Now, he said, we break the curse. We free your wolf. And we find out who you really are when nothing is holding you back anymore. Aldwin stepped forward, his volumes forgotten on the table, his scholarly excitement giving way to reverence. The binding breaks through truth, he said. Not ritual, not counterspell, simply truth spoken aloud by the one who cast it. Senna has confessed what was done. The magical contract is void. Rowan felt it then, a warmth spreading through her chest, starting where the panther's purr had settled hours ago and radiating outward like water soaking into dry earth. Not painful, but intense. Overwhelming. The silver shimmer on her palm flared bright enough to cast shadows on the chamber walls. It's happening, Cale said, and his voice carried a note she had never heard before. Wonder. The binding is breaking. Senna made a sound, half sob and half gasp, and pressed her hands to her mouth as she watched her daughter's body begin to glow with the same silver light the panther could see, now visible to everyone in the room. Rowan's knees buckled. Cale caught her before she fell, one arm around her waist, steadying her against him, and the panther pressed close on her other side, supporting her weight between them. Breathe, Cale said quietly, his mouth close to her ear. Just breathe through it. Let it come. The warmth became heat, became fire burning through her veins, and she felt something inside her chest that had been locked away for 20 years beginning to wake, beginning to stretch, beginning to remember what it was supposed to be. Her wolf, never absent, only sleeping, suppressed, waiting to wake. The shift took her without warning. One moment she was standing in Cale's arms in human form, and the next her bones were rearranging themselves with a speed that should have been agonizing but felt like relief, like a joint popping back into place after years of dislocation. White fur erupted across her skin. Her hands became paws, claws scraping against stone. Her spine extended, her face elongated. Her senses exploded outward into a range and depth she had never imagined possible. She could smell everything. The ancient stone of the chamber. The lamp oil burning in the sconces. Cale's scent, cedar and steel, and something uniquely him. Senna's grief, acrid and sharp. Aldwin's excitement, sweet like honey. She could hear the heartbeat of every person in the East Wing, could hear water moving through pipes 3 floors below, could hear the wind outside the high windows whispering against glass. She could see in the dim corners of the chamber as clearly as in the lamplight, could see the silver-gold thread connecting her to Kale still visible, even without the panther's sight, could see the way magic moved through the air like heat shimmer. Rowan lifted her head and looked at herself, reflected in the polished surface of Aldwin's abandoned teacup. A white wolf looked back, pure white, like fresh snow, like winter starlight. Larger than she expected, nearly as tall at the shoulder as the panther itself. Eyes the color of liquid silver glowing faintly in the chamber shadows. Beautiful, powerful, unmistakably royal. The panther moved toward her slowly, deliberately, and touched its nose to hers. The purr that rumbled through its chest was approval and recognition and welcome, and Rowan felt tears she could not shed in this form burning behind her eyes. Extraordinary, Aldwin breathed. The white wolf, the mark of true Thornwolf lineage. There hasn't been one in 3 generations. Kale had shifted too, she realized. His silver wolf stood beside her now, slightly larger, his fur the color of moonlight on steel. He looked at her with those same intelligent eyes, and she saw in them everything he could not say in this form. Pride, certainty, connection, and something else. Something that made the bond between them pull tighter, made the silver-gold thread glow brighter. Recognition of mate. Rowan turned and ran, not away, but toward the chamber door that Aldwin hurriedly opened, toward the spiral stairs she took 3 at a time, toward the east wing quarters and the main entrance, and the training grounds beyond where she could feel pack members gathering drawn by something they could not name but could not ignore. She burst through the palace doors into the late afternoon light, and 200 wolves turned as one to look at her, and as one they fell to their knees, human and wolf alike dropping where they stood, unable to resist the pull of true royal blood finally revealed. Some looked confused, some looked awed. All of them looked certain, their wolves recognizing what their minds might question. Princess, true heir, royal line unbroken. Kale's silver wolf emerged behind her, and the panther after him, and the 3 of them stood on the palace steps as the sun began to set over Silverpine territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elder Alpha Theron, 75 years old and silver-haired, rose from his knees first. His voice carried across the silent grounds. The prophecy, he said, the voiceless one has been found. The true line endures. A murmur rippled through the crowd, building into something like awe, like relief, like the sound of a story completing itself after 23 years of interruption. Rowan shifted back to human, her body remembering how now the transition smooth. She stood naked in the evening air, unconcerned, because she could feel Kyle moving behind her, draping his shirt over her shoulders, covering her with protective instinct that had no claim of ownership in it. "Welcome home, princess," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. And Rowan Ashwood, daughter of Dorian Thornwolf, bearer of the white wolf chosen of the Shadow Panther mate to the king who stood beside her, looked out over 200 wolves who had finally seen her after 23 years of being invisible. She smiled. "I'm home," she said, and believed it. The days that followed were a kind of transformation that had nothing to do with shifting forms and everything to do with learning to inhabit a life that had shape and size and visibility in it. There was the ongoing investigation into Greythorn. The counselor, now 70 years old, was brought before Kale 3 days after Rowan's wolf emerged. He did not deny his role in Dorian's death. "I followed my king's orders," Greythorn said, standing in the great hall before the assembled council of 6. "Aldrich commanded it. I obeyed." "And what," Kale asked quietly, "gave Aldrich the right to murder his own brother, to order the death of an infant child?" Greythorn's jaw tightened. "Prophecy. The child threatened everything we had built, everything the Thornwolf line represented." "The child," Rowan said, stepping forward from where she had been standing at Kale's side, "is standing in front of you. And I threaten nothing except the comfortable lie that power gives you the right to decide who lives and who dies." The silence in the great hall was absolute. Kale had summoned not just the Council of 6, but representatives from the 7 territories of the Western North American Pax, the High Wolf Council, that met only for matters of territorial law and justice. They sat in a semicircle behind the Council of 6-7 Alpha Kings, whose combined authority superseded any single pack's internal politics. At the center sat High King Thaddeus Ironmaw of the Cascade Territory, 72 years old and sharp-eyed, who had been ruling longer than Kyle had been alive. "Counselor Greythorn," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "you are accused of regicide, the murder of Prince Dorian Thornwolf, a member of the royal line." "How do you answer?" "I followed orders," Greythorn repeated. "That is not a defense under pack law," Thaddeus said. "Article 12 is clear. No order, however high its origin, justifies the murder of royal blood. The pack survives through its lineage. To kill a prince is to wound the pack itself. He leaned forward slightly. You will be tried under the ancient laws. The evidence will be heard. And if you are found guilty, the penalty is exile to the frozen wastes. Do you understand? Graythorn's face went pale, but he nodded. The trial took 4 hours. Senna testified first, her voice steady as she described the night Graythorn came to the cottage with 4 guards and silver coins. She described hearing Dorian die. She described running. Aldwin presented historical documents, letters between Aldrich and Graythorn discussing the problem of the prophecy and eliminating future complications. Rowan testified about the 23 years of believing herself broken, about the binding curse that had stolen her wolf, about the life that had been taken from her before she was old enough to remember having it. And finally, Kale presented the blood test results, the genealogical records, and the physical evidence of the mate bond forming between himself and Rowan through the Panther's recognition. The prophecy was not a threat, Kale said. It was a promise that the old ways of ruling through fear and suppression would end, that power would be balanced with mercy, that the voiceless would be heard. He looked at Graythorn directly. You tried to kill that promise. You failed. The 7 members of the High Wolf Council conferred for less than 10 minutes before Thaddeus stood and read the verdict. Marcus Graythorn, we find you guilty of regicide under Article 12. We find you guilty of conspiracy to use forbidden magic under Article 7. We find you guilty of attempting to subvert prophecy under Article 3. He paused. The sentence is exile to the barren tundra of northern Alaska to be enacted immediately. You will be stripped of all rank, all property, and all connection to pack life. You will wear a wolfsbane collar that prevents shifting for the remainder of your natural life. Your name will be struck from the Hall of Records. Your bloodline ends with you. Graythorn was led away by 4 elite guards, and Rowan watched him go and felt nothing but a vast relief that justice had been served. Not revenge, justice. The Binding Moon ceremony happened 2 weeks later. It was held at the Moonstone Altar, a sacred site on the highest peak of the Silverpine Range, under a full moon that seemed larger and brighter than any Rowan had ever seen. 300 pack members made the climb to witness it. The ceremony was ancient, older than the Thornwolf line itself, and it required only 3 things: moonlight, truth, and choice. Rowan stood in a circle of white stones that had been placed there centuries ago by wolves whose names had been lost to time. She wore a simple dress the color of starlight, her dark hair loose down her back, her feet bare on cold stone. Kale stood across from her, dressed in the formal leathers of a king, but without the chain of office, without any symbol of rank, except the silver wolf that paced beneath his skin, visible in his eyes. The elder priestess, not Moira, who had died 5 years ago, but her successor, a woman named Kara, who was 50 and solemn, stood between them. This ceremony, Kara said, her voice carrying across the silent peak, recognizes what already exists. The mate bond does not form here. It has already formed. We merely witness it. We merely name it. We merely celebrate it. She looked at Rowan. Rowan Ashwood, daughter of Dorian, bearer of the White Wolf, chosen of the Shadow Panther. Do you stand here of your own choice? I do, Rowan said. Do you accept Kale Thornwolf as your mate, your equal, your partner in all things? I do, Rowan said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Kara turned to Kale. Kale Thornwolf, son of Aldrich, Alpha King of Silverpine, bearer of the Silver Wolf. Do you stand here of your own choice? I do, Kale said. Do you accept Rowan Ashwood as your mate, your equal, your partner in all things? I do, Kale said, and there was something in his voice that made the bond between them glow brighter, made the silver gold thread visible to everyone watching. Kara lifted her hands to the moon. Then by the light of the binding moon, by the witness of the pack, by the ancient laws that govern all wolves, I name you mated. I name you bound. I name you one. Kale crossed the circle in 3 strides and took Rowan's face in his hands and kissed her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. And the Shadow Panther, sitting at the edge of the circle beside Rowan's White Wolf and Kale's Silver Wolf, threw back its head and roared. The sound echoed across the mountains, and 300 wolves answered their voices, rising in a harmony that had not been heard in Silverpine for 3 generations. 6 months later, on a morning when spring had turned to summer and the cherry trees in the east gardens were heavy with fruit, Rowan stood in front of a new building on the western edge of the palace grounds. It was 3 stories tall, built of stone and timber in the same style as the stables, but the windows were larger and the entrance had a sign carved in oak Silverpine Academy for Omegas. 47 students had enrolled in the first term. They would learn storm reading and territory mapping and healing arts and voice command and every other skill that Rowan had taught herself in the margins of a life that had tried to keep her small. They would learn that being Omega did not mean being powerless, that being wolfless did not mean being broken, that the pack's strength came from all its members, not just the ones who could fight. Senna worked there too. She taught healing in the mornings and spent her afternoons in quiet conversation with her daughter, slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been broken by 23 years of necessary distance and grief. It was not easy, but it was happening. Kale found Rowan standing in the garden looking up at the building, and he came to stand by her the way he always did now, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that the bond between them hummed with contentment. "They're going to do well," he said. "You've given them something no one else could." "Hope?" Rowan asked. "Agency," Kale said. "The knowledge that they can shape their own futures, that they don't have to accept what they're told they are." Rowan leaned into him, and his arm came around her shoulders, and they stood like that for a long time, watching students arrive for the morning session, watching a future unfold that neither of them had imagined 6 months ago. The Shadow Panther appeared from the garden shadows, moving with that liquid silence, and it came to sit at Rowan's feet the way it always did now, claiming her as its own. "Do you ever regret it?" Kale asked quietly. "Giving up the chance to run, the maps you made, the life you were planning?" Rowan thought about the girl she had been 6 months ago, the one who counted days until she could disappear, the one who believed she was nothing. "No," she said, "I don't regret it. I was running toward emptiness. I just didn't know there was another option." She looked up at him. "You gave me that option. You and the Panther. You saw me when I couldn't see myself." "The Panther saw you first," Kale said. "I just had the sense to listen to it." He pulled her closer. "And for the record," he said, "I'm very glad I did." Rowan smiled, and the bond between them flared bright and warm, and somewhere in the distance she heard the first students of the academy laughing as they learned to read the sky for storms, and she thought about prophecy. When shadow finds the voiceless one, the silent throne shall wake. She had been voiceless, silent, invisible, but she had been found. And the throne that had woken was not one of power or politics or dominion over others. It was the throne of knowing who you were, of claiming the space you occupied in the world, of refusing to let anyone else define your worth. That was the prophecy's true promise. And as Rowan stood in the garden with her mate at her side and her white wolf warm in her chest, and the Shadow Panther pressing against her legs, and 47 Omega students learning that they were enough exactly as they were, she understood that the prophecy had been fulfilled not in the moment she was found, but in every moment since then when she chose to stay found, to stay visible, to stay whole, to stay home.